So, back in 2012, a law was passed that was supposed to be a total game changer for small businesses. It was called the Jobs Act. And the big promise was that it would unlock this huge flood of investment cash. But, did it actually deliver? Or did it just create a massive nightmare of regulatory confusion for the very entrepreneurs it was supposed to help? So, what's the real story with the Jobs Act? Was it this golden ticket for startups, or was it more like a regulatory minefield? Well, to figure that out, we've got to rewind a bit and really understand what this law was designed to do, and maybe more importantly, why the first people who tried to use it found themselves in such a tough spot. To really get the impact of the Jobs Act, you have to picture the scene right after it launched. Honestly, it was just this chaotic mix of incredible excitement and total unpredictability. And yeah, that quote, it just nails it. It really was like a gold rush for investment money, but there were no clear rules. And the sheriff, in this case, the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, was basically learning the ropes right along with everyone else. For entrepreneurs, it was absolutely thrilling. But let's be honest, it was also a pretty terrifying time to make a move. Okay, so beyond all that chaos, what was this law even supposed to accomplish? Let's break down what the original promise really was. The name kind of says it all, right? Jumpstart Our Business Startups. Before this act, if you wanted to raise money from the public, that was a game for giants. It cost millions in legal and accounting fees. This law was meant to level the playing field, to give those smaller, innovative companies a real shot at playing in the big leagues. So how'd it work? Well, the act brought in some new rules, like Regulation A+, which let companies raise up to $50 million in what you could call a mini IPO. Then there was Regulation Crowdfunding, letting them raise smaller amounts online. But the real revolution, the seismic shift, was that it allowed companies to take money from non-accredited investors. We're talking about everyday people, not just millionaires. This was supposed to democratize startup investing. Of course, you can imagine opening these floodgates created a massive challenge for the regulators. The SEC had to walk this incredibly fine line. How do you encourage all this new innovation without letting scammers run wild and take advantage of regular folks? It was a classic tightrope act with huge consequences for the first companies brave enough to step out onto the wire. And this brings us to the pioneers. You see, for the first companies that jumped in line to use these new rules, that promise of easy capital, it met a complicated and, frankly, often harsh reality pretty quickly. To really see how this all played out in the real world, let's look at the story of Punch TV Studios. They were the perfect candidate for the Jobs Act, an independent media company with huge dreams. But when they actually tried to use the new law, they found themselves completely trapped in a regulatory labyrinth. This timeline right here shows you just how dangerous that journey was. Look at the beginning. The company proactively reached out to the SEC. Their CEO, Joseph Collins, even invited investigators to their offices to get guidance. But that goodwill gesture, it pushed them right into the next stage. They became the subject of an SEC investigation. And the climax? They ended up facing serious legal and even criminal charges. Now, the resolution is key. They were ultimately cleared of all the criminal charges, but the process itself was just a brutal multi-year ordeal. And look, the Punch TV story wasn't some one-off thing. The real issue was that the SEC was basically making up the rules as they went along. For the entrepreneurs on the front lines, it was like playing a game where the goalposts were constantly moving. Something that seemed totally fine and compliant one day could be the very thing that triggered an investigation the next. So all this uncertainty, it created this massive dilemma for entrepreneurs. Do you try to fly under the radar and hope for the best, or do you reach out to the regulators and risk putting a giant target on your back? It was a true double-edged sword. Deciding to engage with the SEC was just a huge gamble. I mean, on the one hand, if you look at the upside, it shows you're trying to do the right thing, that you're committed. But on the other hand, it puts you directly under a microscope, where every single email, every financial record could be picked apart, and the smallest, most unintentional mistake could have massive consequences. So what was the secret to surviving in this kind of environment? Well, it was this really delicate dance between transparency and just being careful. You had to be open enough to build trust with regulators and show you were acting in good faith, but not so open that you accidentally gave them the ammo to use against you. It was its own strategic tightrope walk. Okay, so what are the real takeaways from this whole story? What can today's entrepreneurs possibly learn from the pioneers who blazed this very, very complicated trail? Now, you might be thinking, all right, but that was 10 years ago. Things have changed. And you're right, they have.
The rules are definitely more settled now. But that fundamental tension between innovating super fast and being careful with regulation, that hasn't gone away. The lessons learned in those early trenches are, believe it or not, more relevant than ever.
So if you're thinking about raising capital today, here's a little playbook based on those hard-won lessons. First, do your homework. Become an expert on the current regulations. Second, and this is a big one, hire a lawyer who specializes in this stuff. This is not a place for amateurs. Third, build a culture of transparency and ethics from day one. And finally, if you do decide to engage with regulators, have a clear strategy and just be prepared for anything. And that really brings us to the big question for entrepreneurs today. Is regulation a protective guide, a helping hand, or is it a restrictive gatekeeper that just gets in the way of innovation? The story of the Jobs Act seems to suggest it can be both. And figuring out how to strike that right balance, that's the challenge that's going to continue to shape the future of business.